really want to kiss you so badly.
The story opens with a visceral, forbidden whisper. I want to kiss you so badly. These words are described as heavy with hunger, raw and reckless, immediately creating a sense of a high-stakes transgression and an irreversible shift in power. Nneka Carolina Eze stands paralyzed against the glass wall of the Kang estate, her breath hitching as the devil of soul looms over her. To the world, Kang Musak is a monolith of violence and control, his neck tattoos a map of his ruthlessness. But here, in the dim light of the corridor, his sleeves are rolled back, his composure is fraying, and his voice carries a desperate need that no subordinate should ever hear. Nneka shouldn't be this close. She shouldn't see the restraint breaking in his eyes. As an undocumented Nigerian woman, invisible is her only protection. But Musak is making her seen in a way that is both protective and terrifying. However, the true danger isn't the man inches from her face, it's the ghost in the glass. Behind them, visible only as a sharp, frozen reflection in the darkened window, stands Yoon Se-ra. The wife's face is a mask of shattered disbelief, her silence more ominous than a scream. In this single breathless moment, the secret whisper has turned the mansion into a minefield. Nneka is no longer just a maid. She is the target of a woman who has everything to lose. And Musak is no longer just a boss. He is a man who has just signed a death warrant with a kiss he hasn't even taken yet. In the sprawling silence of the Kang estate, Nneka had mastered the art of becoming part of the architecture. To be a migrant in soul was to be a shadow. To be a maid for the city's most feared syndicate head was to be a ghost. She moved through the high-ceilinged corridors with a rhythmic, practiced grace, her soft-soled shoes barely whispering against the polished obsidian floors. Her world was measured in the scent of expensive beeswax, the weight of silver trays, and the crushing necessity of silence. Every morning, Nneka would set the breakfast table before the sun fully breached the horizon. She performed her duties with downcast eyes, her natural hair pulled back so tightly it mirrored the rigid discipline of the house. She was a ghost supporting a family thousands of miles in Lagos, her existence validated only by the wire transfers she sent home each month. To Yoon Se-ra, Nneka was less than a person. She was a tool, a dark-skinned fixture that kept the porcelain white and the silk pressed. But lately, the invisibility that kept Nneka safe had begun to flicker. It happened in the small, jagged moments between the family's public perfection. Kang Musak was a man who commanded gravity, his presence pulling the oxygen out of any room he entered. He was usually a storm of controlled violence and hushed phone calls, his tailored suits barely concealing the intricate ink that marked his skin. Yet Nneka began to feel the weight of his attention like a physical heat on the back of her neck. When she served his tea in the library, he no longer looked through her. His gaze would linger on her hands as she set the saucer down, long, steady fingers that contrasted sharply against the white lace of her cuffs. Once, as she reached to straighten a fallen curtain, she turned to find him standing in the doorway, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon's tail coiling around his forearm. He wasn't looking at the room, he was looking at her, his dark eyes narrowed in a way that wasn't predatory, but profoundly lonely. There was a heavy, unspoken language developing in those lingering seconds. While Sarah occupied herself with social calendars and cold critiques, Musak's silence began to feel like a sanctuary. He would pause in the hallway when she passed, his body instinctively tilting toward her, a silent acknowledgement of the only other person in the house who seemed to breathe real air. Nneka felt the dangerous pull of it, the terrifying thrill of being seen by a man who saw everything and spared no one. She was a woman who lived by the border of the glass, always careful not to touch it, unaware that the glass was already beginning to crack under the pressure of a gaze that refused to let her remain invisible. The air in the western wing of the mansion was always colder, a vacuum of sound where the city's roar was stifled by triple-paned glass. Neka moved through the corridor, her shadow stretching long and thin against the floor. She was focused on the task, polishing the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that overlooked the manicured Zen garden, until a sudden, heavy presence shattered her solitude. Kang Musak appeared not as a boss, but as a man fraying at the seams. He didn't speak at first. He simply closed the distance until the heat radiating from his body cut through the drafty hall. Neka's back hit the glass with a soft thud, the cold surface biting into her spine through the thin fabric of her uniform. Musak stepped into her personal space, his hand flying up to brace against the glass beside her head. The movement was swift, the tattoos on his inner wrist flashing like a warning under the recessed lights. "Sir?" Neka's voice was a mere thimble of sound, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Musak didn't retreat. His face was inches from hers, his dark hair falling slightly over eyes that were no longer sharp and calculating, but clouded with a desperate, forbidden hunger. He looked at her natural hair, the curve of her jaw, and finally her lips with a gaze so heavy it felt like a touch. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was thick with the scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne and the unspoken exhaustion of a man tired of being a monster. "I am surrounded by people who want my head or my money," he whispered, his voice a gravelly vibration that sent a shiver down Neka's marrow. "But when I look at you, I feel like I might actually be alive." Neka's breath hitched. She should have pushed him away. She should have remembered the visa, the family in Lagos, the danger of his name. But she remained still, her face lifted toward his in a moment of conflicted calm. The power dynamic had shifted. In this narrow hallway, the king was at the mercy of the maid. "Aneka," he breathed, his name for her sounding like a prayer. "I want to kiss you so badly it's an ache I can't kill." The confession hung in the air, raw and reckless. Musak tilted his head, his eyes fluttering shut as he leaned in, his mouth a breath away from hers. He was unaware that the world was still watching. Behind them, reflected clearly in the darkened glass that looked out onto the night, was the silhouette of Yoon Se-ra. Her face was a pale, jagged mask of shock, her eyes wide as she witnessed the exact moment her husband surrendered his loyalty to a shadow. The reflection captured the betrayal in high definition, turning their intimate sanctuary into a stage for a coming war. The aftermath of the confession did not arrive with a scream or a shattered vase, but with a silence so sharp it felt like a blade against the skin. Yoon Se-ra did not confront her husband, nor did she acknowledge the betrayal she had witnessed in the glass. Instead, she retreated into the shadows of the mansion, transforming from a distant socialite into a meticulous architect of misery. For Aneka, the Cold War began the very next morning at dawn. The demands started small, but grew increasingly nonsensical and cruel. Se-ra began ordering Aneka to hand-scrub the expansive marble foyer with a toothbrush, only to walk across the damp stone in muddy heels moments after it was finished, demanding it be done again. Her voice never rose. It remained a polished, aristocratic hum that carried the weight of a death sentence. "It's still stained, Aneka," she would say, her eyes tracking the maid's movements with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying specimen. "Perhaps you aren't as diligent as my husband thinks." Aneka worked until her knees were bruised and her fingers bled from the harsh chemical lye Se-ra insisted she use without gloves. Sleep became a luxury of the past. If Aneka closed her eyes for an hour, she was summoned to reorganize the vast wine cellar or to iron Se-ra's silk scarves for the third time that night. The psychological pressure was designed to break her spirit, to make her feel small and replaceable, and most importantly, to keep her far away from the Western Wing. Musak, meanwhile, was lured into a false sense of security. He was a man of the underworld, accustomed to seeing threats in the form of bullets and wiretaps, not in the rearranged schedule of a housemaid. Whenever he entered a room, Aneka was conveniently sent away on an errand to the far end of the estate. If he asked for her, Sarah was there with a tight porcelain smile, claiming Aneka was busy or had requested extra shifts to send money home. In the brief moments their paths did cross, Aneka would not look up. She kept her chin tucked, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Musak saw the fatigue, but attributed it to the rigorous standards of his household, unaware that his wife was systematically draining the life from the woman he desired. He would linger in the hallways, hoping for another whisper, another touch against the glass, but the invisible barrier Sarah had built was far stronger than any physical wall. Aneka was trapped in a cycle of impossible labor, a ghost being slowly haunted out of her own existence by a woman who watched from the balcony, waiting for the perfect moment to turn psychological torment into a final, legal execution. The transition from the sterile silence of the mansion to the humid, neon-drenched docks of Incheon happened in a blur of command. Under the guise of needing a discreet attendant for a weekend summit, Musak overrode his wife's objections, pulling Neka from her toothbrush-scrubbing penance and thrusting her into the back of a black armored sedan. For the first time, she saw the boss not as a pining man, but as a sovereign of the shadows. The business trip was a negotiation with a rival faction that had been bleeding into Kang territory. They arrived at a secluded warehouse where the air tasted of salt and industrial grease. Neka was instructed to stay by the car, but the world of the Mafia rarely respects boundaries. When a disagreement erupted inside, the heavy steel doors swung open, and Neka witnessed the sudden, terrifying efficiency of the man she had almost pitied. Musak emerged, his white shirt stained with a spray of crimson that looked like macabre art against the fabric. He was dragging a man twice his size by the collar, his expression a mask of frozen stone. With a terrifying, quiet violence, he pinned the rival against a shipping container. Neka watched, her breath hitching, as Musak leaned in, not with a whisper of love this time, but with a low-frequency threat that made the other man's knees buckle. In that moment, Neka felt a visceral surge of fear. This was the monster the city whispered about. She began to shrink back into the shadows of the sedan, her hands trembling as she realized the true nature of the fire she was playing with. But as the rivals' men began to draw weapons, realizing their leader was compromised, Musak didn't look at his attackers. His eyes snapped immediately to Neka. In a single, fluid motion, he pivoted, placing his own body between her and the line of fire. He didn't call for his guards. He reached back, catching Neka's wrist and pulling her behind the heavy ballistic door of the car. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice vibrating with a protective ferocity that superseded his bloodlust. As bullets began to ping against the reinforced glass, Musak remained a shield of meat and bone, his hand never letting go of hers. It was then Neka realized the terrifying truth. The brutality she was witnessing was the only thing keeping the world from devouring her. He wasn't just a killer, he was a gatekeeper. In the dark heart of the underworld, amidst the scent of gunpowder and iron, she understood that his violence was the cage, and his love was the only thing that made it a sanctuary. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster. The return to the mansion felt like descending back into a tomb. The adrenaline of the docks had barely faded from Neka's veins before the atmosphere of the house settled over her like a shroud. She was back in the uniform, back in the shadows, but the air was charged with a static electricity that warned of a coming storm. It happened in Musak's private study, a room lined with ancient books and the heavy scent of tobacco. Aneka was polishing the mahogany desk when Sarah entered, her silk robe billowing behind her like a pale cloud. She didn't look at Aneka. She looked only at her husband, who sat behind the desk, his knuckles still bruised from the previous night's violence. With a clinical flick of her wrist, Sarah tossed a high-resolution photograph onto the desk. It slid across the wood, stopping right before Musok's hands. Aneka glimpsed it from the periphery, the dark corridor, the glass wall, and the hauntingly clear reflection of Musok leaning into Aneka's space, his forehead nearly touching hers. In the reflection, his longing was naked, a confession written in light and shadow. Behind them, caught in the corner of the frame, was the sharp, jagged silhouette of Sarah watching. "I've spent 3 years ignoring your mistresses, Musok," Sarah said, her voice a thin, freezing wire. "The actresses, the club girls, they were distractions, but this is an infection." Musok didn't flinch. He picked up the photo, his thumb tracing the silhouette of Aneka's face. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable, the ticking of the grandfather clock sounding like a countdown. "She's a maid, Musok, an undocumented nobody from a world we don't acknowledge," Sarah said, her gaze finally snapping to Aneka, filled with a visceral, aristocratic disgust. "She has seen the devil of soul on his knees. She knows the scent of your weakness. For the sake of the family, for the sake of your own reputation, she must be removed, immediately." The word removed hung in the air, heavy with lethal ambiguity. In their world, removal wasn't a resignation, it was an erasure. Musok stood slowly, the photograph crinkling in his grip. He looked at his wife, then at Aneka, who stood frozen with her polishing cloth, the reality of her life hanging by a fraying thread. The power in the room shifted, the cold calculation of the wife meeting the simmering protective fire of the husband. "You think this is about her," Musok said, his voice dangerously low, the quiet rumble of a predator about to strike. "You think she's the one who made me weak. You're wrong, Sarah. She's the only reason I still care about being strong." Sarah's face contorted, her composure finally cracking. "Then you've chosen your side. Just remember, I didn't just take a photo. I've already called the authorities. If you won't remove her, the law will." The transition from psychological warfare to physical entrapment was seamless and surgical. Within an hour of the confrontation in the study, the quiet dignity of Aneka's small basement room was shattered. Sarah had not waited for the law to find a reason, she had manufactured one. Neka was folding her spare uniform when the door was kicked open. 2 officers in dark blues charged in, followed by a smirking housekeeper who had always been loyal to Sarah's coin. Behind them, leaning against the doorframe with the poise of an apex predator, was the wife herself. "Check the mattress," Sarah commanded, her voice like cracking ice. Neka stood paralyzed as they tore her sanctuary apart. Within seconds, an officer pulled a velvet-lined box from beneath her pillow. It snapped open to reveal a diamond necklace, the Blue Empress, a Kang family heirloom worth more than Neka would earn in 10 lifetimes. Alongside it lay a thick envelope stuffed with undeclared cash and a forged ledger of syndicate secrets. "I didn't take that," Neka whispered, her voice trembling but her gaze level. "I have never seen that in my life." "Theft, possession of stolen syndicate property, and, given your status, espionage," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her eyes were twin voids of malice. "The police will enjoy processing a migrant who thought she could climb into her master's bed by stealing his crown." The officers didn't wait for a statement. They grabbed Neka, their grip bruising her arms as they forced her toward the service exit. The walk through the mansion was a gauntlet of shame. The other staff looked away, their faces masks of fearful neutrality. Neka felt the weight of her invisibility finally collapsing. She was no longer a shadow, she was a target. As they reached the driveway, the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol cars painted the marble pillars in violent hues. The cold Seoul air hit her face, smelling of rain and impending doom. She was being shoved into the back of the car when she saw Musok's black sedan roar up the driveway, tires screaming against the gravel. He stepped out before the car had fully stopped, his face a storm of fury. But the police sergeant stepped into his path, holding up the stolen necklace in a plastic evidence bag. "Mr. Kang, we have the thief and the evidence. We'll take it from here." Neka's eyes met Musok's through the rain-streaked window of the police cruiser. She saw the conflict in him, the mafia boss who knew the law was a weapon, and the man who realized his wife had just pulled the trigger. As the car pulled away, Neka pressed her forehead against the cold glass, the reflection of the mansion fading into the dark, knowing that in the eyes of the law she was already guilty. The roar of the engine was the only outlet for the violence simmering in Musok's mains. He didn't follow the police cruiser. He knew the precinct was already a curated stage for Se-Ra's final act. Instead, he tore back into the mansion, his boots thundering against the marble like a war drum. He found Se-Ra in the grand salon, calmly sipping tea while the Blue Empress sat returned to its velvet throne on the coffee table. "You should have let her go, Musok," she said, her voice devoid of its usual frosty poise. "The board of directors is meeting at the docks in an hour. They've seen the photos. They've seen the forged ledgers. They believe you've compromised our secrets for a maid. They are voting for your removal." Musok stopped, his shadows lengthening against the gold-leafed walls. "You didn't just call the police. You called the council." "I called my father's allies," she corrected, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "They are merging with the rivals you fought at the docks. You can keep your empire and your dignity if you sign the papers to have her deported and erased, or you can watch everything we built burn." Musok looked at his wife, seeing for the first time the absolute vacuum where her heart should have been. For years he had protected this syndicate, bled for its borders, and sacrificed his soul to its iron laws. He looked at the glass wall, where only hours ago he had felt the first spark of true life in a decade. "You think this empire is what makes me powerful," Musok said, his voice dropping to a terrifying resonant calm. He walked to the desk, but he didn't grab the pen. He grabbed his encrypted phone and sent a single, scorched earth command to his loyalist captains. "Liquidate all assets. Burn the ledgers. Leave the rivals an empty shell." Sarah stood, her tea spilling onto her silk rug. "What are you doing? That's 30 years of history." "I'm buying her life," he growled, turning toward the door. "The council can have the docks. They can have the warehouses and the blood-stained money. I'm taking the only thing in this house that isn't a lie." He didn't look back as her screams of traitor echoed through the vaulted ceilings. He drove toward the precinct, not as a mafia don, but as a man who had stripped himself of his crown to become a shield. Behind him, the Kang syndicate began to collapse in a series of coordinated explosions and erased bank accounts. He was dismantling his world in real time, trading a throne for a woman who had seen his scars and hadn't flinched. The devil of Seoul was dead. The man who loved Neka was just getting started. The police transport never made it to the precinct. Halfway through the rain-slicked industrial district, the world exploded into a symphony of screeching tires and shattering glass. 3 unmarked SUVs boxed the cruiser in, forcing it into a skid that ended against a rusted warehouse wall. Neka's head slammed against the partition, the world spinning into a hazy blur of red and blue strobes. The men who stepped out of the SUVs weren't police. They were the cleanup crew of the Kang syndicate, loyal not to Musok, but to the board and the legacy Sarah had promised them. They didn't come for an arrest. They came to settle a debt of blood and silence. "Get her out," a voice commanded, cold and devoid of mercy. Neka was dragged from the wreckage, her knees scraping the wet asphalt. She looked up through the rain to see the muzzles of half a dozen suppressed weapons aimed at her heart. These were the men she had served tea to, the men who had once bowed to Musak. Now they were the judges of her life. Then the roar of a lone engine cut through the downpour. Musak's car didn't stop. It plowed through the perimeter of SUVs, a literal battering ram of steel. He vaulted from the driver's seat before the car had even settled, a handgun in each hand, his eyes burning with a feral, scorched earth intensity. "Step away from her," he growled. The sound was low, vibrating through the pavement, more animal than man. "She's a liability, boss," the lead enforcer shouted over the rain. "The board has issued the order. Step aside or go down with the maid." The response was a flash of muzzle fire. Musak moved with a lethal, terrifying fluidness, a dance of lead and shadow. But as the return fire erupted, he didn't dive for cover behind the cars. He threw himself over Neka, his broad back becoming a shield of flesh and bone. Neka felt the violent jolts of his body as bullets found their mark in his shoulder and side. He gasped, a raw, guttural sound of pain, but he didn't move. He stayed hunched over her, his blood dripping onto her uniform, warm and metallic against the cold rain. "Musak, stop," she sobbed, her hands clutching his soaked shirt. "They'll kill you." "Let them try," he wheezed, his voice straining. He turned his head just enough to look her in the eye, his expression one of absolute, terrifying devotion. "I spent my life taking everything I wanted, but I'd give it all back just to keep you breathing." In that moment, the insatiable hunger Sarah had mocked was revealed for what it truly was. It wasn't a desire for power or a round of conquest. It was a vow. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Musak leveled his weapon and cleared the path, his body a blood-stained fortress that refused to fall until his shadow was the only one left standing over her. The morning sun over the Mediterranean didn't carry the biting chill of Seoul. It felt like a warm benediction against Neka's skin. She stood on the terrace of their small villa, watching the turquoise waves lap against the Italian coastline. She was no longer dressed in the stiff, starch-scented black and white uniform that had defined her existence for so long. Instead, she wore a flowing silk dress the color of a burnt sunset, her natural hair free of its tight pins, blooming in a soft, dark cloud around her face. Behind her, the sound of a sliding glass door announced a presence that no longer made her heart stutter with fear, but with a deep, grounded peace. Musak stepped onto the terrace, the harsh light of the coast revealing the truth of his new life. He was no longer the devil of Seoul in tailored armor. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos that were now just ink on a man's skin, rather than symbols of a syndicate's reach. The limp in his gait was a permanent reminder of the night he had served her as her shield, but the cold, calculating hardness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, reflective clarity. He walked to her, his hand, rough-palmed but infinitely gentle, settling on the small of her back. He didn't look at the horizon, he looked at her, his gaze lingering on the woman who had seen his brokenness and chosen to stay. "The lawyer called from Atlanta," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt like home. "Your mother's house is fully paid for. The medical trust is secure. She's coming to visit next month." Neka leaned back into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The weight of her family's survival, which had once felt like a boulder she carried alone in the shadows of a mansion, had finally been lifted. "You kept every word, Musak, even after everything you lost." "I lost a throne I never wanted," he whispered, turning her in his arms so he could look into her eyes. "I traded a crown of thorns for a life where I can breathe. That's not a loss, Neka. That's a rescue." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, in a mirror of the moment against the glass wall a lifetime ago. But this time there were no shadows, no watchful reflections of a vengeful wife, and no secrets hidden in the dark. He didn't have to beg for one more round of affection, or fight a war to prove his worth. "I promised you 50 years, he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. "I think I'm going to need at least 60. Enneka smiled, reaching up to trace the faint scar on his jaw, a mark of his sacrifice. "Then you'd better start now." As they kissed, the only sound was the distant tolling of a village bell and the steady rhythm of the sea, a song of a legacy no longer written in blood, but in the quiet, insatiable peace of a promise kept.
Do you love Afro-Korean stories? Or beautiful love stories like these? Like this video, share, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more beautiful stories. Your support helps to keep the lights on this channel. Thank you.